The current was trying to kill him, and Marcus knew it with every fibre of his being as the violent water dragged him under for the third time. His lungs screamed for air, his arms flailed uselessly against the churning rapids, and the last thing he remembered thinking before the darkness swallowed him whole was that his own family had won. But then, through the roar of the water and the pounding of blood in his ears, he heard a voice cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. "Hold on," someone screamed, and Marcus felt something rough and solid brush against his hand. His fingers closed around it with the desperation of a drowning man, because that's exactly what he was, and suddenly he was being pulled, dragged through the mud and water by someone who refused to let the river claim another victim. When he finally felt solid ground beneath him and coughed up what felt like half the river, gasping and choking and very much alive, he looked up through blurred vision to see a young woman standing over him, covered in mud, breathing hard, and looking at him like she had just wrestled death itself and won. But to understand how Marcus ended up in that river, fighting for his life, we need to go back to where this whole twisted story began, because nothing about the Lawson family was ever simple. Marcus was born into the wealthy Lawson family, but he was never truly part of it, and they made sure he knew that every single day. His father, Chief Richard Lawson, was one of the most powerful men in Lagos, running a shipping empire that stretched across West Africa like a spider's web. The Lawson mansion in Ikoyi was the kind of place that made people stop and stare, with its high gates, manicured gardens, and enough rooms to get lost in for days. But for Marcus, that mansion was a beautiful prison, where he was the unwanted guest who could never leave. You see, Marcus was born out of wedlock, the living proof of Chief Lawson's affair, and Lady Beatrice, the chief's wife, never forgave him for existing. While the chief was alive, Marcus was tolerated in the way you might tolerate a permanent stain on expensive carpet, acknowledged but despised. He lived in a small room at the back of the mansion, ate his meals after everyone else had finished, and learned very quickly to make himself invisible whenever possible. His half-siblings, Victor and Clara, treated him like he was something they had stepped in on the street. Victor was the oldest, built like a bull and twice as mean, with the kind of arrogance that only comes from never being told no in your entire life. Clara was quieter but just as poisonous, always watching Marcus with cold eyes that calculated his worth and found it severely lacking. Lady Beatrice had spent years whispering poison into her children's ears, painting Marcus as the thief who had come to steal their inheritance. And honestly, by the time Chief Lawson got sick, you could practically feel the hatred radiating off them like heat from asphalt. When Chief Lawson finally passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning in April, Marcus knew his comfortable misery was about to get a whole lot worse. The funeral was massive, with politicians crying fake tears and businessmen pretending they had lost a dear friend, but Marcus stood alone at the back of the church, because not a single person wanted to be seen standing next to the illegitimate son. It would have been funny if it wasn't so painfully humiliating. 3 days after they buried the chief, the family gathered in his study for the reading of the will. The room smelled like old leather and expensive cigars, and Marcus sat in a chair that felt too small while the family lawyer, Mr. Adebio, adjusted his thick glasses and cleared his throat so many times Marcus thought the man might cough up a lung. Victor sat sprawled in the best chair like he already owned the place, which, to be fair, he probably thought he did. Clara examined her perfectly manicured nails with the kind of boredom that suggested she was already mentally spending her inheritance. Lady Beatrice wore black from head to toe, but her eyes were bright and eager, like a hawk watching a mouse. "To my son Victor," Mr. Adebio read in his dry, dusty voice, "I leave the entirety of Lawson Shipping Company, including all vessels, contracts, and associated assets." Victor smiled like a shark that had just spotted blood in the water, and honestly, the smugness was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. "To my daughter Clara, I leave the real estate portfolio, including all rental properties, commercial buildings, and land holdings in Lagos and Abuja." Clara actually giggled, a high-pitched sound that made Marcus's teeth hurt, and she immediately started texting someone on her phone, probably already planning how to spend the money. "To my beloved wife, Beatrice, I leave all liquid assets, investment accounts, and the family mansion in Ikoyi." Lady Beatrice nodded like a queen accepting tribute, though Marcus could see the slight disappointment in her eyes because she had probably been hopping for everything. Then Mr. Adebio paused, and the pause stretched so long that Marcus genuinely thought maybe that was it. Maybe his father had decided to pretend he didn't exist even in death. But then the lawyer cleared his throat one more time and said, "And to my son Marcus, I leave the 2-acre plot of land near the Blackwood River on the outskirts of Lagos." The silence lasted exactly 2 heartbeats before Victor exploded into laughter. And I'm not talking about a polite chuckle or a suppressed giggle. This was full-blown, tears-streaming, can't-breathe laughter that echoed off the walls and made him sound like a hyena that had just heard the world's funniest joke. Clara joined in immediately, her high-pitched cackling mixing with Victor's deeper guffaws until the whole room sounded like a zoo at feeding time. "The swamp," Victor wheezed, actually slapping his knee like some kind of cartoon villain. "He gave you the swamp. Oh my God, this is perfect. This is absolutely perfect." Clara was doubled over, holding her stomach. "That land is completely useless. It floods every single rainy season. You can't even walk on it without sinking up to your knees in mud." Even Lady Beatrice allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, like someone who had just watched their enemy trip and fall in public. Mr. Adebio handed Marcus the deed with an apologetic look that said he knew exactly how worthless this gift was, and Marcus could see the pity in the old lawyer's eyes, which somehow made everything worse. Marcus took the yellowed paper with hands that didn't shake, even though his insides felt like they were being shredded. That land was notorious for being absolutely worthless, marshy, prone to flooding, miles from civilization, and about as useful as a chocolate teapot. His father had basically given him nothing and made it look like something. But Marcus stood up with his back straight and his head high, and without saying a single word to any of them, he walked out of that study with whatever dignity he had left. He went to his small room at the back of the mansion, packed his few belongings into one battered suitcase that had belonged to his mother, and left the Lawson mansion forever. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody even bothered to say goodbye. Victor was probably still laughing. Marcus moved into a tiny apartment in Agegunnel, one of the rougher parts of Lagos. The kind of neighborhood where the buildings leaned against each other like drunk friends, and the streets smelled like a combination of fried food, exhaust fumes, and desperation. His apartment was one room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen all at once, with a bathroom that had definitely seen better days about 2 decades ago, and a window that looked out onto an alley filled with trash bags that nobody ever collected. But it was his, paid for with his own money, and that meant something. Hey my people, Happy New Year to you and yours. I'm wishing you all the blessings, breakthrough, and success this year. Fam, if you're already hooked on this story, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love connecting with you all. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and join this storytelling family, because we have some incredible stories lined up for you this year. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now let's get back to Marcus, because his struggle was just beginning, and things are about to get a whole lot worse before they get better. The next few months were brutal in ways Marcus had never imagined. He took whatever odd jobs he could find, carrying heavy bags at the market for a few hundred naira, washing cars in parking lots under the scorching sun, delivering packages on a rusty bicycle that threatened to fall apart with every bump. Some days he ate nothing but bread and water because that was all he could afford. He learned what real hunger felt like, the kind that makes your hands shake and your stomach cramp and your thoughts go fuzzy around the edges. But Marcus kept his head up and his mouth shut, working hard and saving every single naira he could, because he refused to go crawling back to that mansion, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Pride might not keep you warm at night, but it was the only thing he had left, so he clung to it like a lifeline. Then, about 7 months after he had walked out of the Lawson mansion for the last time, someone knocked on his apartment door. Marcus opened it and found Victor standing there, dressed in an expensive Italian suit that probably cost more than Marcus's entire year of rent, looking around the cramped apartment with his nose wrinkled like he had just stepped in something disgusting. "Wow," Victor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm thick enough to spread on toast. "Nice place you've got here, Marcus. Really living the dream, aren't you?" Marcus didn't respond. He just stood there and waited because he knew Victor hadn't traveled all the way to Agegunnel just to insult his apartment. He could have done that over the phone. Victor got bored with the silence pretty quickly and cut straight to the point. "Look, I'll make this simple. I want to buy that swamp land from you." Marcus raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Why would you want it?" Victor shrugged, but the gesture was too casual, too rehearsed. "I'm thinking about building a boat shed, maybe using it as storage for some shipping equipment. The riverside location could be useful for loading and unloading." It was possibly the worst lie Marcus had ever heard, and that was saying something because Victor had never been good at lying. But Marcus didn't call him out on it. He just crossed his arms and waited. Victor cleared his throat and continued, "I'll give you $500 for it, cash right now. That's way more than that worthless land is worth, and we both know it. You should be grateful I'm even offering. $500. Marcus looked at his half-brother standing there in his expensive suit with his expensive watch and his expensive car probably parked outside, and he thought about his empty refrigerator and his overdue rent and the hole in his only pair of shoes. $500 would solve so many immediate problems. But something about the way Victor was standing, the slight desperation hiding behind the arrogance, the fact that he had come here at all, it all told Marcus that something wasn't right. "The land is worth at least $5,000, Marcus said calmly, and he watched Victor's face carefully. For just a second, something flickered in Victor's eyes, panic maybe, or anger, before the smug mask slammed back into place. 5,000, Victor laughed, but this time it sounded forced, almost hysterical. Then he did something that made Marcus's blood boil. He spat directly onto Marcus's floor, a deliberate insult meant to show exactly how little respect he had. "You illegitimate rat, you'll starve in the gutter before you see that kind of money from anyone." Then Victor started saying terrible things about Marcus's mother, calling her names so vile and disgusting that Marcus felt his hands curl into fists at his sides and his vision narrow to a red tunnel. But he didn't swing. He didn't shout. He just walked to the door, opened it wide, and said in a voice that shook with barely controlled rage, "Get out. Now." Victor smirked, clearly enjoying the reaction. "Or what? What are you going to do about it?" But Marcus didn't take the bait. He just stood there holding the door, his entire body trembling with the effort of not doing something he knew he would regret. "I will never sell that land to you," Marcus said quietly, and every single word was a promise carved in stone and sealed with blood. "Not for 5,000, not for 5 million, not if I'm dying in the street and you're my last hope. That land is mine and you will never ever have it." Victor's smirk twisted into something ugly and cold. "You're going to regret this," he said as he pushed past Marcus into the hallway. "You'll come crawling back, begging me to take it off your hands, and when you do, I won't even offer you 100. Marcus slammed the door and leaned against it, his legs suddenly weak, his heart pounding like he had just run a marathon. He had just turned down money he desperately needed out of pure spite and pride, and he honestly didn't know if that made him strong or stupid. He slid down to sit on the floor, his head in his hands, and wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that he had just made the best decision he would ever make. And he had absolutely no idea that in exactly 1 year and 2 months, Victor and his entire family would wish they had never heard the name of that swamp land near Blackwood River. Time moved slowly when you were barely surviving, and for Marcus, the next year crawled by like a wounded animal dragging itself across broken glass. Every morning he woke up in that cramped apartment with its peeling walls and its smell of mildew that never quite went away. And every morning he had to decide whether to eat breakfast or save the money for rent. Most mornings, rent won that battle, so Marcus got very familiar with the hollow feeling in his stomach, and the way hunger makes everything seem just a little bit further away than it actually is. He worked whatever jobs he could find, and Lagos had plenty of work for people desperate enough to take it. He carried cement bags at construction sites until his shoulders screamed and his back felt like it might snap in half. He washed dishes at a local restaurant where the owner paid him under the table, and the other workers pretended he didn't exist. He even spent 2 weeks cleaning out septic tanks, which was exactly as terrible as it sounds. But it paid slightly better than the other jobs, and Marcus had learned that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. But here's the funny thing about rock bottom. Once you're there, you start to notice things you never saw before. Like the fact that the old woman who sold oranges on his street corner always gave him an extra one when she thought he wasn't looking. Or that the security guard at the construction site would sometimes share his lunch with Marcus, claiming he had packed too much food even though they both knew that wasn't true. These small kindnesses kept Marcus going when everything else wanted to drag him down, and he made a mental note to pay them back someday when he wasn't living on the edge of complete disaster. The only bright spot in his entire miserable existence was Tuesday evenings. Every Tuesday, when the sun started to set and the heat of the day finally broke, Marcus would take his ancient fishing rod, the one thing he had managed to keep from his childhood, and head out to the Blackwood River. Specifically, he went to his land, that supposedly worthless swamp that Victor had laughed at so viciously. The land was exactly as awful as everyone had said it would be. The ground was soft and marshy, your feet sank into the mud with every step, and during the rainy season the whole area flooded so badly that you couldn't even tell where the river ended and the land began. But Marcus didn't care about any of that because the river bend near his property had fish, and fish meant free dinner, and free dinner meant he could save a little more money for rent. So every Tuesday evening, Marcus would stand on the muddy bank, cast his line into the brown water, and for a few hours he could pretend that life wasn't slowly crushing him under its weight. Sometimes he caught enough fish to eat for 3 days. Sometimes he caught nothing and went home hungry. But those evenings by the river were his, and nobody could take them away from him. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that while he was struggling to catch fish for dinner, his half-siblings were about to receive news that would change everything. Meanwhile, at the Lawson mansion in Ikoyi, Lady Beatrice was having her afternoon tea on the veranda when the security guard informed her that she had visitors. "Government officials, ma'am," the guard said, looking nervous in the way people always looked nervous when dealing with Lady Beatrice. "They say it's urgent." Lady Beatrice frowned because she hadn't been expecting any government officials, and she absolutely hated surprises, but she nodded graciously and told the guard to send them in. 5 minutes later, a fleet of black government SUVs rolled through the mansion gates like a presidential motorcade, and suddenly the peaceful afternoon turned into something much more interesting. The lead official was a tall man with silver hair named Mr. Okonkwo, and he had the kind of face that suggested he had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. He was accompanied by 3 other officials carrying leather briefcases and wearing expressions of professional seriousness that immediately put Lady Beatrice on alert. Victor and Clara were summoned from their respective rooms, and soon the entire family was seated in the main living room that was bigger than most people's entire houses. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice," Mr. Okonkwo said, settling into one of the expensive leather chairs like he was sitting on a throne. "We have some rather exciting news regarding your family's property holdings." Victor leaned forward immediately because Victor's ears perked up at the word exciting, the way a dog's ears perk up at the word treat. Clara tried to look bored, but Marcus would have recognized the gleam of greed in her eyes from a mile away. Mr. Okonkwo opened his briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents covered in stamps and signatures. "As you may or may not be aware, the Ministry of Natural Resources has been conducting geological surveys across Lagos State for the past 18 months. We've been looking for mineral deposits, oil reserves, that sort of thing." "How fascinating," Lady Beatrice said in a tone that suggested she found it anything but fascinating. "But what does this have to do with us?" Mr. Okonkwo smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested he was about to say something that would blow their minds. "Everything, Lady Beatrice. You see, one of our survey teams recently completed a comprehensive analysis of the land near Blackwood River, specifically the 2-acre plot that appears to be owned by your family." Victor and Clara exchanged glances, and you could practically see their brains working because they both knew exactly which plot Mr. Okonkwo was talking about. The swamp, the worthless swamp they had laughed at. The swamp Marcus owned. "And," Victor said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably, because his voice cracked slightly on the single word. Mr. Okonkwo's smile widened. "And it turns out that land isn't just swamp. Beneath the surface, approximately 8 to 12 meters down, lies one of the largest gold veins we've discovered in this region in over 3 decades. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Lady Beatrice's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Clara's mouth literally fell open in a way that would have been hilarious if the situation wasn't so serious. Victor went completely pale, then bright red, then pale again like someone was flipping a light switch inside his face. "Gold," Victor finally managed to croak out. "You're saying there's gold under that swamp?" Mr. Okonkwo nodded, clearly enjoying their reactions. "Significant quantities of gold, yes. Our preliminary estimates suggest the vein could be worth somewhere in the range of several $100 million, possibly more depending on the depth and purity of the deposits." "Several $100 million. Clara made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a squeak, like a mouse that had just won the lottery. Victor looked like he might actually pass out, his fancy silk shirt suddenly dark with sweat under the arms. Lady Beatrice, to her credit, maintained her composure, but her hand was shaking so badly that tea sloshed over the rim of her cup and onto the expensive Persian rug below. "The government is prepared to offer a very generous compensation package to begin mining operations immediately," Mr. Okonkwo continued, pulling out more documents. "We're talking full market value for the gold deposits, plus additional compensation for surface rights, plus a percentage of the mining profits. This could easily be one of the most lucrative deals any private landowner has made with the government in recent history." Victor's brain was clearly working overtime because he suddenly sat up straighter and said, "That land belongs to the family. My father left it to us." It was a lie, a blatant lie, and they all knew it, but Victor said it with such confidence that for a moment even he might have believed it. Mr. Okonkwo raised an eyebrow and consulted his documents. "Our records indicate that the land was specifically bequeathed to a Marcus Lawson. Is he present?" The temperature in the room somehow managed to drop about 10 degrees despite the Lagos heat. Lady Beatrice's smile became tight and forced. "Marcus is no longer with us," she said carefully, which was technically true because Marcus was no longer with them in that mansion, though the way she said it definitely implied something more permanent. "I see," Mr. Okonkwo said, making notes. "In that case, we'll need to see the original deed and have the current owner present for the signing. The government cannot release compensation of this magnitude without proper verification of ownership." Victor jumped in quickly. Of course. We have all the necessary documents. Just give us a few days to gather everything together." "Excellent," Mr. Okonkwo said, standing up and extending his hand. "We'll schedule a formal meeting for next Friday at the ministry offices. Please bring the original deed and the legal owner. This is very exciting news for your family, truly." He smiled warmly, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just set off a bomb in the middle of the Lawson family's carefully constructed lies. The moment the government officials drove away, the peaceful facade shattered like dropped glass. "The original deed," Clara hissed, already pulling out her phone. "Where's the original deed?" Victor was packing back and forth like a caged tiger. "Marcus has it. That bastard has it, and he doesn't even know what he's sitting on." Lady Beatrice stood up slowly, her face a mask of cold calculation. "Then we need to get it from him. We need to convince him to sell." Victor laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You weren't there, Mother. I offered him $500 and he turned me down. Said the land was worth $5,000. He was being stubborn just to spite me." "Then offer him more," Lady Beatrice said sharply. "Offer him whatever it takes. 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. I don't care what number it takes to make him sign, just get that deed." Clara was already doing calculations on her phone. "If we offer him 50,000 and the land is worth hundreds of millions, we'd still be getting it for basically nothing." "He can't know about the gold," Victor said firmly. "If he knows, he'll never sell. We tell him we feel bad about how things ended, we want to make amends, we're offering him a generous price out of family loyalty." Lady Beatrice nodded approvingly. "Perfect, family loyalty. He always was a sentimental fool about family, even after everything we did to him." Victor grabbed his car keys, already heading for the door. "I'll go now, I'll make him an offer he can't refuse." But as he rushed out, Clara called after him, "And Victor, be nice this time, we need him to like us." Victor waved dismissively over his shoulder, but Lady Beatrice and Clara exchanged a look that said they both knew Victor had exactly two modes: arrogant and more arrogant. Back at his apartment, Marcus had no idea that 3 government SUVs had just left the Lawson mansion, or that his worthless swamp had suddenly become worth more money than he had ever imagined in his wildest dreams. He was sitting on his bed, eating plain rice for dinner, because that was all he could afford, and trying to decide whether he could skip washing his one good shirt for another day, or if it had reached the point where people would definitely notice. His Tuesday fishing trip was tomorrow, and he was actually looking forward to it in the way that people look forward to small moments of peace in otherwise chaotic lives. He had no idea that tomorrow would never come, at least not the way he expected. He had no idea that Victor was already planning to show up at his door with an offer that seemed too good to be true, because it absolutely was too good to be true. And he definitely had no idea that refusing that offer was going to set off a chain of events that would end with him fighting for his life in the cold, violent waters of the Blackwood River, while his own family celebrated what they thought was his elimination. Victor showed up at Marcus's apartment the very next morning, and this time he came bearing gifts like some kind of twisted Christmas miracle. When Marcus opened the door, barely awake and definitely not prepared for company, he found Victor standing there with a bright smile that looked like it physically hurt his face to maintain, holding a bag of fresh bread, a container of butter, and what appeared to be actual imported coffee. "Marcus," Victor said with enthusiasm so forced it was almost painful to witness. "Good morning, brother. I brought breakfast." Marcus stared at him like he had suddenly started speaking in tongues, because this was the same Victor who had spat on his floor and insulted his dead mother just 7 months ago. And now he was here with bread and butter like they were best friends who had simply lost touch. "What do you want, Victor?" Marcus asked, making no move to let him inside. Victor's smile faltered for just a second before snapping back into place like a rubber band. "I want to talk, that's all. Can I come in, please?" The please was what really threw Marcus off, because he was pretty sure he had never heard Victor say that word in his entire life, at least not to him. Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped aside and let Victor into the apartment. Victor looked around with what he was probably trying to pass off as casual interest, but Marcus could see him cataloguing every detail of the cramped space, every sign of poverty and struggle. "So," Victor said, settling onto the rickety chair that Marcus used for both sitting and as a makeshift table. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation." "Have you?" Marcus said flatly, crossing his arms and staying standing because he wasn't about to get comfortable with a snake in his home. Victor nodded earnestly, And honestly, if Marcus didn't know better, he might have actually believed the concern on his half-brother's face. I was harsh, I was cruel. I said terrible things about your mother, and I felt awful about it ever since. Marcus raised an eyebrow because Victor feeling awful about anything other than losing money was about as likely as the sun rising in the west, but he didn't interrupt. Victor continued, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. The truth is, Marcus, I've been doing a lot of soul searching lately. Dad's death made me realize that life is short, and family is important, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life feuding with my own brother over something as stupid as pride. How touching, Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Get to the point, Victor. Victor's smile tightened just a fraction. The point is, I want to make things right. I want to help you out. That's why I'm here to make you a serious offer for that land. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach because he knew this was coming, but he had hoped he was wrong. I'm prepared to offer you $15,000, Victor said, and he said it like he was offering Marcus the keys to heaven itself. Cash, today, right now if you want it. That's triple what the land is actually worth, and we both know it. $15,000. Marcus looked at his half-brother and thought about what $15,000 could buy. A better apartment, food that wasn't plain rice or stale bread, clothes without holes, maybe even enough left over to actually save some money for the first time in his life. But he also thought about Victor's face when he had offered $500, the contempt and the cruelty and the absolute certainty that Marcus would eventually cave. He thought about Lady Beatrice's cold eyes and Clara's mocking laughter at the will reading. He thought about spending his entire childhood being treated like he was less than human, and something hard and stubborn settled into his chest like concrete. No, Marcus said simply. Victor blinked like Marcus had just slapped him. No, Marcus, did you hear what I said? $15,000. That's more money than you've probably seen in your entire life. Marcus felt anger starting to simmer in his veins because Victor just couldn't help himself, could he? He couldn't make an offer without also making sure to remind Marcus of how poor and pathetic he was. I heard you, Marcus said coldly. The answer is no. Victor's fake friendly mask started to crack around the edges. Marcus, be reasonable. What are you going to do with that swamp? You can't build on it, you can't farm it, it's completely useless to you. Marcus shrugged. Maybe I like fishing there. You like fishing there, Victor repeated slowly like he was trying to understand a foreign language. You're turning down $15,000 because you like fishing there. Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. That's right. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to get to work. Victor stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and Marcus could see him struggling to maintain his composure. $30,000, Victor blurted out, and now there was definitely desperation creeping into his voice. I'll give you $30,000 right now, today. That's an insane offer, Marcus. You'd be a fool to turn it down. $30,000. Marcus felt his resolve waver for just a second because $30,000 was life-changing money, the kind of money that could completely transform his situation. But then he looked at Victor's face and saw the desperation there, the barely concealed panic, and suddenly he understood. Victor needed this land. Not wanted it, needed it. And if Victor needed it that badly, then there was something about that swamp that Marcus didn't know yet. $50,000, Marcus said suddenly, testing a theory. If you want it so badly, bring me $50,000 and maybe we'll talk. He expected Victor to laugh, to tell him he was insane, to storm out like he had done before. But instead, Victor went very still, and Marcus watched a series of emotions flicker across his half-brother's face. Calculation, fear, anger, and finally something that looked almost like defeat. I'll have to talk to Mother and Clara, Victor said quietly. And that's when Marcus knew for absolute certain that something was very, very wrong with this entire situation. Because the old Victor would have told him to go to hell before admitting he needed to consult with anyone about anything. Victor left without another word, and Marcus stood in his apartment feeling like he had just stumbled onto something important, but didn't quite understand what it was yet. His instincts were screaming at him that this was all wrong, that there was some piece of information he was missing, some crucial detail that would explain why Victor had just offered him $30,000 for land that flooded every rainy season. Back at the Lawson mansion, Victor's return was met with immediate questioning. Well, Lady Beatrice demanded before he had even fully entered the living room. Did he agree? Victor shook his head, and he looked genuinely shaken in a way that Clara had rarely seen. He refused $15,000. He refused $30,000. What? Clara shrieked, jumping up from the sofa. Is he insane? What could he possibly want with that land? Victor collapsed into a chair and loosened his tie like it was strangling him. He knows, Victor said quietly. He has to know about the gold. There's no other explanation. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed dangerously. Did he say anything about gold? Did he give any indication? Victor shook his head. No, but why else would he refuse $30,000? He's living in poverty, Mother. His apartment is smaller than our bathroom. He should have jumped at the money, but instead he asked for $50,000. $50,000? Clara's voice was shrill with panic. Did you agree? Victor nodded slowly. I told him I'd have to discuss it with you, and he didn't seem surprised. He's playing with us. Lady Beatrice stood up and began packing, her mind clearly working through various scenarios and possibilities. We meet with the government officials on Friday. That's 4 days from now. We need that deed by Thursday at the latest. So we pay him the $50,000, Clara said, though she looked physically pained at the thought. $50,000 for hundreds of millions is still a bargain. But Lady Beatrice shook her head slowly, and there was something cold and calculating in her expression that made both her children go very still. We're not paying him $50,000. We're not paying him anything. What are you suggesting? Victor asked, though from the way his face went pale, Marcus suspected he already knew. Lady Beatrice turned to look at her children, and her voice was as cold as ice when she spoke. If Marcus is gone and there is no next of kin listed on any documents, the land reverts to the siblings as part of the estate. That's standard inheritance law. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and for a long moment nobody moved or spoke. Clara's eyes went wide with shock and fear. Mother, you can't be suggesting, Lady Beatrice cut her off with a sharp gesture. I'm not suggesting anything, I'm simply stating a legal fact. Now, does anyone know Marcus's routine? Does he go anywhere regularly where he might be? Alone. Victor swallowed hard, and Marcus could see him wrestling with his conscience, which admittedly probably wasn't much of a wrestling match because Victor's conscience had always been more of a suggestion than a rule. He goes fishing, Victor said quietly. Every Tuesday evening at the Blackwood River. He goes to his land, stands by the rapids, completely alone for hours. Today is Tuesday, Lady Beatrice observed calmly, like they were discussing the weather instead of plotting someone's elimination. How convenient. Clara stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. I can't be part of this. This is insane. He's our brother. Lady Beatrice's eyes flashed dangerously. He is not your brother. He is an obstacle standing between us and hundreds of millions of dollars, and obstacles, my dear Clara, must be removed. Victor was staring at his hands like he might find answers written on his palms. There are people, he said slowly, carefully. People who handle these kinds of situations for the right price. Lady Beatrice nodded approvingly. Then make the call. The government officials return on Friday. We need this resolved by Thursday at the absolute latest. And that's how it was decided, in a beautiful mansion in Ikoyi over imported tea and expensive furniture, that Marcus Lawson would not live to see another Wednesday. They didn't think of it as ending someone's life, because that would require acknowledging Marcus as a person. And they had spent so many years convincing themselves that he was nothing more than an inconvenience, a stain on their family name, that it was surprisingly easy to make the leap from insults to something far more permanent. Victor made the call that afternoon, speaking in hushed tones to people he had done business with before in less legal ventures. 3 men, large and brutal and unburdened by things like conscience or mercy, agreed to handle the situation for a price that Victor paid without hesitation, because what was $50,000 compared to hundreds of millions. That evening, as the sun began to set over Lagos, and the heat of the day finally started to break, Marcus grabbed his old fishing rod and headed out to the Blackwood River, completely unaware that 3 men were already positioned along the riverbank, waiting in the shadows like predators watching their prey. He had no idea that his own family had just signed his death warrant, or that he was walking directly into a trap that had been carefully laid just for him. He walked to his usual spot where the river bent sharply and the current ran fast and deep, cast his line into the brown water, and settled in to wait for fish that would never come. Behind him, hidden in the tall grass and the lengthening shadows, 3 pairs of eyes watched his every move and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Marcus never heard them coming, and by the time he realized something was wrong, it was already far too late to run. The attack came so suddenly that Marcus didn't even have time to process what was happening before a heavy cloth bag was yanked over his head, plunging him into complete darkness. His fishing rod clattered to the ground as massive hands grabbed him from behind, one arm locking around his throat while others seized his arms and legs. Marcus fought with everything he had, kicking and thrashing and trying to scream. But the cloth muffled his voice, and there was nobody around to hear him anyway, because that was exactly why they had chosen this spot. Stop struggling, a deep voice growled in his ear, and Marcus could smell cigarettes and cheap alcohol on the man's breath. This'll be easier if you just accept it. But Marcus had spent his entire life being told to just accept things, accept that he wasn't really family, accept that he didn't deserve respect, accept his poverty and his loneliness and his position at the bottom of the world, and he was done accepting anything. He threw his head backward and felt it connect with something solid, heard a satisfying grunt of pain, and for just a second the grip on him loosened. Marcus used that second to twist free and try to run, but there were 3 of them and only one of him, and one of the men stuck out a massive leg that sent Marcus crashing face first into the muddy ground. Before he could get up, they were on him again, dragging him toward the river's edge where the current ran fast and vicious. "Message from Victor," one of them whispered, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice because of course it was Victor, who else would it be? They hauled him to his feet at the very edge of the rapids, and Marcus could hear the water churning below, could feel the spray on his face even through the bag over his head. "Nothing personal," another voice said, and then they threw him. The sensation of falling seemed to last forever and no time at all, and then Marcus hit the water and the cold knocked every bit of air from his lungs. The current seized him immediately, dragging him under with the force of an angry beast, and Marcus tumbled through the dark water completely disoriented and terrified. He tried to swim but didn't know which way was up, tried to breathe but only swallowed muddy water that burned his throat and filled his lungs with liquid fire. The bag on his head made everything worse because he couldn't see, couldn't orient himself, and his hands were too busy trying to keep him afloat to pull it off. The rapids bashed him against rocks that he never saw coming, and Marcus felt his shoulder slam into something solid with a crack that might have been the rock or might have been his bones breaking. Pain exploded through his body, but the river didn't care, just kept dragging him downstream, rolling him like clothes in a washing machine. Marcus's lungs were screaming for air, and his vision was going dark around the edges, or maybe that was just the bag over his head. He couldn't tell anymore. His strength was fading fast, his limbs going heavy and useless, and he thought with strange detachment that this was it. This was how he was going to die, drowned in a river on land that technically belonged to him, eliminated by a family that had never wanted him alive in the first place. His last conscious thought was a bitter laugh at the irony of it all. He finally owned something, and it was going to be his grave. Then the darkness swallowed him completely, and Marcus knew nothing at all. Miles downstream, in a small village that most people in Lagos didn't even know existed, a young woman named Sarah was washing clothes by the riverbank. She was thin in the way that people who don't always have enough to eat tend to be thin, with strong arms from years of manual labor and kind eyes that had seen too much hardship for someone so young. Sarah had been orphaned at 12, when a fever took both her parents within a week of each other, and she had been surviving on her own ever since, taking whatever work she could find and living in a tiny hut at the edge of the village. She was scrubbing a shirt against the rocks, her hands raw and red from the cold water, when she noticed something floating downstream. At first she thought it was a log or maybe a dead animal, but then she saw an arm reach up out of the water in what looked like a desperate grasp for something that wasn't there, and Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. Most people would have run away, would have assumed it was a corpse or a spirit or something dangerous best left alone. But Sarah had been saved by kindness more times than she could count in her short, difficult life, and she believed deeply in paying that kindness forward whenever possible. So instead of running, she dropped the shirt she was washing and looked around frantically for something, anything she could use to help. There was a fallen tree nearby, one of its branches extending toward the water like a skeletal hand, and Sarah grabbed the longest, sturdiest branch she could break off. It was heavy and awkward, and her muscles protested as she dragged it to the water's edge, but she didn't stop because that person out there was drowning and every second counted. "Hold on," Sarah screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cutting through the sound of the rushing water. "Please hold on." She waded into the river, gasping as the cold water hit her legs, and the current immediately tried to sweep her feet out from under her. Sarah dug her bare feet into the mud and rocks at the bottom, planting herself as firmly as she could, and extended the branch as far as her arms could reach. Marcus was barely conscious, his brain shutting down from lack of oxygen, but some primitive instinct heard that voice and reached for it like a drowning man reaching for the surface. His hand hit something solid and rough, and his fingers closed around it with the desperation of someone who knew this was their last chance at survival. "I've got you," Sarah shouted, though she wasn't sure she actually had him because the current was so strong, and he was so heavy and her arms felt like they might tear right out of their sockets. "Don't let go. Whatever you do, don't let go." She started pulling, using every ounce of strength in her body, her feet sliding in the mud as the river tried to claim both of them. Marcus's grip on the branch was weakening, his consciousness fading in and out like a radio with bad reception, but Sarah refused to give up. She adjusted her stance, digging her heels in deeper, and pulled with everything she had. Her back screamed, her shoulders burned, her legs trembled like they might collapse at any second, but she kept pulling because giving up meant watching someone die, and Sarah had seen enough death for one lifetime. Inch by agonizing inch, Marcus's body moved toward the shore. Sarah's vision was going spotty from the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. When Marcus was finally close enough, she dropped the branch and grabbed his shirt with both hands, hauling him the last few feet onto the muddy bank with a final, desperate heave that left them both collapsed in the shallow water. Marcus wasn't breathing. His lips were blue, his skin was cold, and the bag was still over his head, soaking wet and probably suffocating him even now. Sarah yanked the bag off and threw it aside, then rolled Marcus onto his back and started pounding on his chest the way her father had taught her years ago when he was training to be a volunteer at the village clinic. "Come on," Sarah muttered, pressing down hard on Marcus's sternum with both hands. "Come on, don't you dare die on me now, not after I just pulled you out of that river." She pressed down again and again, counting in her head, praying to every deity she could think of that this would work. Just when she was starting to think it was hopeless, Marcus's body convulsed and he coughed up what seemed like half the river, muddy water spewing from his mouth as he gasped and choked and finally drew in a ragged breath of air. Sarah sat back on her heels, her whole body shaking from exhaustion and relief, and watched as Marcus continued to cough and gasp, his chest heaving as his lungs remembered how to work. For several minutes neither of them moved or spoke, both too exhausted to do anything but breathe. Sarah's clothes were soaked through, her hands were bleeding from where she had gripped the rough branch, and every muscle in her body felt like it had been stretched beyond its limit. But she was smiling because the man was alive, and that felt like a victory worth celebrating even if nobody else would ever know about it. When Marcus finally had enough air in his lungs to speak, the first thing he said was, "Thank you." His voice was rough and broken, his throat raw from swallowing river water, but the words were clear enough. Sarah helped him sit up slowly, supporting his back because he was still too weak to do it on his own. "What happened?" Sarah asked gently. "Did you fall in?" Marcus looked at her with eyes that were haunted and angry and afraid all at once, and he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "My family tried to kill me." Sarah's eyes went wide because that was not the answer she had been expecting, and she opened her mouth to ask more questions, but Marcus suddenly slumped against her, his remaining strength completely spent, and she realized he was in no condition to explain anything right now. Sarah was small and Marcus was not, but she had spent years carrying heavy loads and working jobs that required strength beyond her size. She got one of his arms around her shoulders, wrapped her own arm around his waist, and somehow managed to get them both standing. Her hut was only about 50 meters away, though it felt like 50 miles by the time she finally got Marcus inside and lowered him onto her one piece of furniture, a thin mattress on the floor that served as both bed and sofa. Marcus was shivering violently now that the adrenaline was wearing off, so Sarah covered him with her only blanket, which wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She built up her small fire and set water to boil for tea, all while keeping one eye on Marcus to make sure he was still breathing. When the tea was ready, she helped him sit up enough to drink it, holding the cup to his lips because his hands were shaking too badly to hold it himself. "You're safe now," Sarah said softly, though she had no idea if that was actually true. "Rest. We'll figure everything out in the morning." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to explain everything that had happened and warn her that she might be in danger just for helping him, but his body overruled his brain and he felt himself sinking into unconsciousness, even as he tried to fight it. As Marcus slept fitfully and with nightmares chasing him through his dreams, Sarah sat by the fire and thought about what he had said. His family tried to kill him. What kind of family did that? What could possibly be worth killing someone over? She looked at the man sleeping on her mattress, this stranger she had pulled from the river, and wondered what storm she had just invited into her quiet, simple life. Back in Lagos at the Lawson mansion, Victor was pouring expensive whiskey for himself and his mother while Clara sat in the corner looking vaguely ill. "It's done," Victor said, and he tried to sound confident, but his hand shook slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. The men confirmed he went into the rapids. Nobody survives those rapids. Lady Beatrice nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Tomorrow we'll report him as missing, file the appropriate paperwork, and by Friday we'll have everything in order for the government officials." She raised her glass in a mock toast. "To Marcus, may he rest in peace." Victor clinked his glass against hers, but the smile on his face looked more like a grimace, and when he drank the whiskey it burned going down in a way that had nothing to do with the alcohol. Marcus spent 3 weeks in Sarah's tiny hut, drifting in and out of consciousness, while his battered body slowly remembered how to function. The first week was the worst, with fever dreams that made him cry out in the night, and chills so violent that Sarah had to pile every piece of fabric she owned on top of him just to keep him from shaking apart. She fed him thin soup made from whatever vegetables she could afford, changed the bandages on his cuts with strips torn from her own worn clothing, and sat up watching him through the long dark hours when his breathing got shallow, and she worried he might slip away despite all her efforts. Sarah asked no questions during those first terrible days, just focused on keeping him alive, but Marcus talked anyway in his fever-addled state. He told her everything: the mansion in Ikoyi, the will reading, the worthless swamp land, Victor's visits with increasingly desperate offers. Sarah listened to it all while she stirred soup and wiped his burning forehead with cool water, and she started to piece together a story that made her blood run cold. By the second week, Marcus was strong enough to sit up on his own, and his mind had cleared enough to realize just how much danger he had put this complete stranger in. "You should have left me in the river," he said one evening, his voice still rough but functional. "My family thinks I'm dead. If they find out I survived, if they find out you helped me." He didn't finish the sentence because they both knew how it ended. Sarah just smiled and handed him a bowl of soup that was slightly thicker than the watery broth he had been managing earlier. "Then we'll make sure they don't find out until you're ready," she said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Besides, I didn't pull you out of that river just to let you give up now." Marcus looked at this young woman who had saved his life and asked for nothing in return, who was sharing her limited food and her only shelter with a stranger. And he felt something shift in his chest that might have been hope, or might have been gratitude, or might have been something he couldn't quite name yet. By the third week, Marcus was able to stand and walk short distances without feeling like his legs might give out, and that's when everything changed. Sarah had a small battery-powered radio that she kept for emergencies and news, and one evening while she was cooking dinner, she turned it on to catch the weather report. Instead, they got breaking news that made them both freeze in place. The government mining project near Blackwood River remains stalled. The news anchor's voice crackled through the cheap speaker, and Marcus felt his heart start to pound. Officials report they are still unable to locate Marcus Lawson, the legal owner of the 2-acre property, sitting atop what experts estimate could be one of the largest gold deposits discovered in Lagos State in the past 30 years. The deposit, valued at several $100 million, cannot be accessed without the proper documentation and the owner's presence. Gold, the word hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly everything made terrible, perfect sense. Sarah turned to look at Marcus, her eyes wide with understanding. "That's why," she whispered. "That's why they wanted your land, that's why they tried to." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to because Marcus was already there, his mind racing through every interaction with Victor, every desperate offer, every moment of suspicious behavior. "They knew," Marcus said, and his voice was shaking with rage and something that might have been bitter amusement. "They knew about the gold and they thought they could buy it from me for pennies because I didn't know. And when I wouldn't sell..." He stood up abruptly, ignoring the way his still healing body protested the sudden movement. "I have to go back. I have to stop them before they forge documents or bribe officials or find some way to steal what's mine." Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. "You can't go back looking like this," she said firmly, gesturing at his torn, muddy clothes that were basically rags at this point. "You show up looking like you've been living in the river and they'll never take you seriously." She walked over to a small wooden box in the corner of the hut, the one where she kept her most precious possessions, and pulled out a small cloth bag that clinked with the sound of coins. "This is everything I've saved for the past 2 years, Sarah said, holding the bag out to Marcus. "It's not much, but it should be enough to buy you decent clothes and maybe a bus ticket back to Lagos." Marcus stared at the bag like it might bite him. "I can't take your money, you've already done so much." Sarah cut him off by pressing the bag into his hands. "You can and you will, because you're going to need it. And besides, you're going to pay me back tenfold when you get that gold money, right?" She said it lightly like a joke, but Marcus looked at her seriously and said, "Yes, I will, I promise you that." Then a thought occurred to him and his face went pale. "The deed. Sarah, where's the deed? Those men threw me in with my clothes. If it was in my pocket, it's gone. It's at the bottom of the river somewhere, and without it, I can't prove." "Relax," Sarah said, and now she was actually smiling. "When I pulled you out, I went through your pockets to see if you had any identification. I found the deed, completely soaked, and I hung it up to dry. It's a bit worse for wear, but it's readable." She walked to the corner and pulled out a yellowed, water-stained document that looked like it had been through a war, which in a way it had. Marcus took it with shaking hands and felt tears prick his eyes because this piece of paper was everything. It was proof and ownership and power, and it had survived just like he had. "There's something else," Marcus said slowly, an idea forming in his mind that was either brilliant or completely insane. "When I go back to Lagos, when I confront them and claim what's mine, I need to make sure they can never do this again. I need to make sure that if something happens to me, the land doesn't go to them." He looked at Sarah steadily. "I want to name you as co-owner and beneficiary." Sarah's mouth fell open in shock. Marcus, you barely know me, you can't just— Marcus interrupted her gently. You saved my life when my own blood tried to end it. You fed me when I was helpless, sheltered me when I had nowhere to go, and just now you offered me your life savings without hesitation. You're more family to me than anyone who shares my last name has ever been. His voice was fierce with conviction. If something happens to me, I want you to have it, all of it. You deserve it more than they ever will. Hey my people, Happy New Year to all of you. I hope this year brings you everything you've been praying for and more. Fam, we're getting close to the end of this story, and things are about to get absolutely crazy. If you're loving this journey, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think is going to happen next. Are you Team Marcus, or are you worried about what the Lawson family might do? And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming in the next part of this story. We're building something special here, this storytelling family, and I want you to be part of it. Now let's get back to Marcus, because the day of reckoning is here and it's going to be intense. The next morning, Sarah used her savings to buy Marcus a clean white shirt and black trousers from the market. Nothing fancy but respectable enough that he looked like a man who couldn't be pushed around. She also bought him proper shoes to replace the ruined ones he had lost in the river. And when Marcus looked at himself in the small cracked mirror Sarah owned, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. He looked harder somehow, like the river had washed away something soft and left behind pure steel. They took a bus to Lagos, Sarah insisting on coming with him because she said someone needed to watch his back, and she didn't trust him not to do something stupid in the heat of the moment. The bus ride took 3 hours, and Marcus spent the entire time holding the deed in his hands, his thumb tracing the water-stained words that declared him the legal owner of land worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Friday arrived, and at the Ministry of Natural Resources, the conference room was filled with government officials, lawyers, and the Lawson family dressed in black like they were attending a funeral. Lady Beatrice sat at the head of the table with Victor on her right and Clara on her left, and they all wore expressions of practiced grief that might have fooled someone who didn't know better. "We're here to finalize the transfer of the Blackwood River property," Mr. Okonkwo said, shuffling papers on the table in front of him. "I understand there were some complications regarding the original owner." Victor nodded solemnly, and honestly, if Marcus had been there, he might have applauded the performance because Victor looked genuinely devastated. "Our brother Marcus passed away tragically 2 weeks ago," Victor said, his voice heavy with fake emotion. "He drowned in the Blackwood River, ironically on the very property we're here to discuss." "How terrible," Mr. Okonkwo said sympathetically. "And you have the death certificate?" Lady Beatrice pulled out an official-looking document that she had obtained through a combination of bribery and forgery and slid it across the table. "Filed with the proper authorities," she said smoothly. "And here is a copy of an updated will that Marcus signed just days before his death, leaving all his property to his siblings. The will was a complete fabrication, created by a lawyer who charged obscene amounts of money to not ask questions, but it looked official enough to pass a cursory inspection." Mr. Okonkwo examined both documents, his brow furrowed with concentration, and Victor felt sweat starting to form under his expensive suit because this was it. This was the moment where their plan either worked or fell apart completely. Mr. Okonkwo looked up and opened his mouth to speak, probably to approve the transfer, when the heavy double doors of the conference room exploded open with a bang that made everyone jump in their seats. Marcus stood in the doorway with Sarah right beside him, and if someone had thrown a live grenade into the room, it would have caused less shock than his sudden appearance. Victor's face went through about 17 different colors in 3 seconds, finally settling on a greyish-white that suggested he might actually faint. Clara made a sound like a strangled cat and grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling out of her chair. Lady Beatrice's practiced composure shattered like dropped glass, and her mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out, like a fish gasping on dry land. "I object," Marcus said, and his voice was calm and cold and absolutely final. He walked into the room with Sarah at his side, his limp from the river attack barely noticeable but there nonetheless, and the authority in his bearing made it clear that he was not here to ask for anything. He was here to take what was rightfully his. "Marcus," Victor finally managed to choke out, and he looked like he had just seen a ghost, which in a way he had because they all thought Marcus was dead and gone and out of their lives forever. "But, the river, you..." He couldn't seem to form a complete sentence, his brain unable to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. "The river refused to keep me," Marcus said, moving closer to the table with deliberate steps. "Which is unfortunate for you because it means I'm here to tell everyone in this room exactly what you did." Mr. Okonkwo stood up, his hand moving toward the phone on the table. "Perhaps someone should explain what's happening here," he said, looking between Marcus and the Lawson family with growing suspicion. Marcus turned to address the entire room, and his voice was steady and clear despite the rage burning in his chest. "That death certificate is a forgery," he said, pointing at the document on the table. "And that will is a complete fabrication. I never signed anything leaving my property to them." He pulled the water-stained deed from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. "Here is the original deed to the Blackwood River property, given to me by my father, Chief Richard Lawson. I am the sole legal owner." "He's lying," Victor shouted, jumping to his feet with panic written all over his face. "He's an imposter, arrest him. That's not even the real deed, it's obviously been tampered with." Marcus smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Commissioner Johnson," he said, addressing the police commissioner who had been sitting quietly in the corner observing the proceedings. "If you check the riverbank at mile marker 4 on the Blackwood River, you'll find tire tracks from a black SUV. And if you question the men who frequent the bars near Agegunnel, you'll find 3 individuals who were recently paid a substantial sum to make someone disappear into that river." The commissioner's expression hardened, and he pulled out his phone to make a call. Victor started backing toward the door, but 2 security officers had already moved to block his exit. "You can't prove anything," Victor said, but his voice was shaking and everyone in the room could hear the fear. "It's your word against ours." "Actually," Sarah spoke up for the first time, and her voice was quiet but steady, "I pulled Marcus out of that river. I saw the bag over his head. I heard him say his family had tried to kill him, and I've been taking care of him for the past 3 weeks while he recovered from injuries that were definitely not accidental." She looked at Victor with contempt. "So it's not just his word, it's mine too." Lady Beatrice finally found her voice, and she tried one last desperate play. "This is absurd. You're going to believe some nobody from a village over a respected Lagos family. We were trying to help Marcus, and this is how he repays us." But her words fell flat because everyone in the room could see the guilt written all over the Lawson family's faces, could see the way they couldn't meet anyone's eyes, could see the panic and the desperation and the knowledge that they had been caught. Mr. Okonkwo sat down heavily and looked at Marcus with something approaching respect. "Mr. Lawson, I assume you're here to proceed with the legitimate transfer of mining rights?" Marcus nodded. "I am, but first I need to make one change to the ownership documents." He pulled out a pen and a fresh form that Sarah had helped him prepare on the bus. "I'm adding Miss Sarah Okafor as co-owner of the property and my sole beneficiary in the event of my death." The room erupted in protests from the Lawson family, but nobody was listening to them anymore. The commissioner's officers were already moving to place Victor and Lady Beatrice under arrest, reading them their rights while Clara sobbed in the corner claiming she hadn't wanted any of this, which may or may not have been true, but definitely wasn't going to save her from facing charges. Marcus signed the new ownership documents, then Sarah signed them with shaking hands, and Mr. Okonkwo stamped them with official seals that made everything legal and binding. "Congratulations, Mr. Lawson and Miss Okafor," Mr. Okonkwo said with a genuine smile. "You are now the official owners of what will likely become one of the most profitable mining operations in Lagos state history." As Victor was being led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at Marcus one last time, and the hatred in his eyes was so pure and intense that it could have burned holes through steel. "This isn't over," Victor hissed. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started. Our family has connections you can't even imagine, Marcus. Powerful people who don't take kindly to being embarrassed." Lady Beatrice said nothing as she was escorted out, but the look she gave Marcus promised that this war was far from finished, that she would find a way to destroy him even from behind bars if that's what it took. Clara just cried, her perfect makeup running down her face in black streaks. But even through her tears, Marcus could see the resentment and the anger and the promise of future revenge. The heavy doors closed behind them, and suddenly the conference room was quiet except for the sound of Marcus and Sarah breathing. They had won. They had actually won. The gold was theirs, the land was theirs, and Marcus had not only survived his family's attempt to eliminate him, but had turned the tables so completely that they were now the ones facing consequences. But as Marcus watched those doors close, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's words weren't just empty threats, that there were pieces of this story he still didn't understand, connections and power structures that ran deeper than family loyalty or even greed. Sarah must have sensed his unease because she squeezed his hand and said, "What are you thinking?" Marcus turned to look at her, this woman who had saved his life and asked for nothing in return, who was now a millionaire because of his gratitude, and he wanted to tell her that everything was going to be fine, that they had won and could finally rest. But something in Victor's eyes, something in the way Lady Beatrice had smiled even as they led her away, made him pause. "I'm thinking," Marcus said slowly, his mind already working through possibilities and threats he couldn't quite articulate yet, "that we need to be very, very careful. Because families like mine don't just lose gracefully. They regroup, they plan, and they come back harder. Outside the ministry building, a black car with tinted windows sat idling at the curb, and inside that car someone was making a phone call that would change everything Marcus thought he had won. "It's done," the voice said quietly into the phone. "The deed is legitimate and the transfer has been processed. But sir, there's been a complication. Marcus Lawson survived, and he's added a beneficiary to the ownership documents. A woman named Sarah Okafor from a village downstream." There was a long pause, then a voice on the other end of the phone spoke, and even though the words were too quiet to hear, something about them made the person in the car sit up straighter and nod seriously. "Understood, sir. I'll make sure they're closely monitored, and if the opportunity presents itself..." Another pause. "Yes, sir, permanently, I understand completely." The black car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into Lagos traffic. And Marcus and Sarah, celebrating their victory inside the ministry building, had no idea that their troubles were just beginning, that the Lawson family was only the first layer of a much deeper, much more dangerous conspiracy, and that the true battle for the Blackwood River gold hadn't even started yet. Hey fam, Happy New Year one more time. I hope you enjoyed this incredible journey with Marcus and Sarah. But here's the thing, this story is far from over. We've barely scratched the surface of what's really going on here. Marcus thinks he's won, but you and I both know that families with power and money don't go down that easily. What do you think is going to happen next? Who was that person in the black car? What connections do the Lawsons have that we don't know about yet? Drop your theories in the comments, because I love hearing what you think. If you haven't already, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel, because part 2 of this story is going to be absolutely insane. We've got conspiracies, we've got power plays, we've got Marcus and Sarah trying to navigate a world of wealth and danger they never asked for. You don't want to miss what happens next, trust me on that. Till next time, stay blessed, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the people who try to bury you don't realize they're actually planting seeds. Marcus was supposed to disappear, but instead he became the one thing his family never expected, a threat they couldn't eliminate. And that's where our next chapter begins. See you in part 2.